So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Walter Rodney Seminar. My name is Eric Schmidt. I'm the Assistant Director here at the BU African Studies Center. It's a pleasure to welcome Tim Weiskel, who's been a visiting researcher here since, I think, March last year, actually. I think he kind of joined us right before things kind of shut down and stuff. So it's good to have you around. Tim graduated from Yale and subsequently trained as a social anthropologist and historian as a Rhodes Scholar at Balliol College in Oxford and at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris. Following fieldwork in West Africa, he received his DPhil from Oxford and returned to the US to teach anthropology and history at Williams College, Yale, and a series of research and teaching positions at Harvard. He's had a long connection to the African Studies Center here at BU. He's actually from Newton, Mass. And in 1963, while he was a high school student, he participated in the American Field Service student exchange program in Damascus, Syria. He returned from the experience determined to learn Arabic and focus his work on learning all he could about the dispossessed Palestinian communities that he had come to know while living in Damascus. And in the spring of 1964, a high school history teacher urged him to come along to the weekly seminar series held at the BU African Studies Center back on the corner of Prescott and Lenox Streets. In an effort to introduce him to North African and other Arabic-speaking scholars at BU, who he thought might help Tim get started in Arabic work. And so in the spring 1964, Tim attended those weekly seminars, which were sort of what evolved into the Rodney seminars that we know. I think the name change came in 1980 or 1981. But it was during that period that he met Dan McCall, as well as visiting scholars such as Elliot Skinner, Thomas Hodgkin, Ruth Schachter, Morgenthau, and Jeffrey Butler, who collectively began to steer his interests towards sub-Saharan Africa. He has a rich array of scholarly activities, including research on French colonial rule in Côte d'Ivoire, environmental ethics and public policy, and sustainability. There are far too many for me to enumerate here, but you can learn more about his work as we will in just a minute. But more recently, he's been working on developing some rich open access resources for African studies available to anyone with a smartphone. In particular, this includes the African Historical Graphics Archive that he launched as an initiative to digitize rare and valuable graphic materials important for the study of African history. In addition, along with fellow Africanist scholars, he has convened the Africa Map Circle to share the online investigation and discussion of African historical cartography. So we'll be learning more about some of these resources today. So Dr. Tim Weiskel, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. And that's right. I've been around for a while, the African Studies Center. What I thought I'd do is go through a few slides to begin with, and then say one or two things that involve judgments. Can you see the slide, the introductory slide saying I'm Tim Weiskel?
Yes.
Okay. Basically, I wanted to indicate that I owe you a lot of thanks at the African Studies Center for the years, because as Eric mentioned, I started in '64 as a senior in Newton High School to come into the seminars that were held mainly in this room on the corner of the Lenox Prescott corner property. It was really quite plush in a way, and it had wood panels, and it made us think it was really quite venerable place to be spending our time. And at the time I met Dan McCall. He provided both the insight and inspiration that attracted many of us, not just me, but a lot of people to become Africanists at the time. I show his book, Africa in Time Perspective, because it was a discussion, as it says, of historical reconstruction from unwritten sources. Now, this was new to me. I was just becoming a historian as a senior in high school, and the idea of doing something from unwritten sources seemed rather novel. But it was published in that same year that I was a senior and started coming to the seminars. So I was fascinated by this and learned very quickly that he was an anthropologist. Although he'd started out as a historian at Columbia, he basically had migrated intellectually to becoming an anthropologist. And he published this thing in a very interesting series of institutions, if you want to call them that. It was a series of lectures that he gave in 1961 at the University of Ghana at the time, invited by the provost there at the time. And that was the very first year after they became independent in 58, but basically they had set up the university at Legon, and he was one of the first foreign lecturers there. And it then came through a whole series of very interesting programs and was published by the Boston University Press, which was new to me at the time, and the Legon University Press. And moreover, it was distributed worldwide through the University Bookshop in Legon in Accra. And then distributors elsewhere included Oxford University Press, London, Glasgow, New York, Toronto, Melbourne. Okay, I figured the guy had global scope back in 1964, and African studies might be an interesting thing to get into, even though I was focused, as Eric mentioned, on the prospect of trying to learn Arabic and spend more time in Arabic-speaking countries. But what struck me in his book was a particular chapter that he wrote on crops, herds, and people, namely the interaction of the biological with the human in such a way that you could start to learn something about the history of human interaction with the environment. He quoted Collingwood in the beginning of his own book. The historian can rediscover what has been completely forgotten, in the sense that has no statement of it has reached him by an unbroken tradition from eyewitnesses. He can even discover what, until he just discovered it, no one ever knew. This he does partly by the critical treatment of statements contained in his sources, partly by the use of what are called unwritten sources. Now, at the time, this was largely an invitation to look at oral history in Africa. But his chapters included, as I say, that one on crops and animals and herds and the like. But in any case, that's part of how I got, in a sense, tripped into African studies and tricked into African studies by the thinking that was going on between historians and anthropologists about Africa in time perspectives. Other books were published in that same year, 64, that I was a senior in Newton High. And one of them was Political Parties in French-Speaking West Africa by Ruth Morgenthau. Now, you'll probably remember her as well. She's an amazing scholar in her own right, and got her DPhil at Oxford after working throughout French West Africa on the primary research of the political process in the 1950s. As it turns out, from 1965 onwards, I became interested in the former French colony of the Ivory Coast, partially because I went out in the summer of 65 to work on a field project of Operation Crossroads in a group that was also containing several other high school and college people from the United States, Canada, and Africa, one of them whom was Jeannie Hay, who you may well remember at the African Studies Center. She, for a long time, worked in the role of coordinator there at the African Studies Center. I thought I'd take a look briefly at the Ivory Coast and what it looks like, what it means. Basically, the Ivory Coast doesn't have much ivory left in it, but it has a whole lot of coast. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of miles of coast. So we can take a brief look at it if I can figure out how to navigate this in such a way that will give you a sense, in a sense, of the terrain that I worked on and in for several years after 1965, but in particular, I was introduced to it in the summer of 1965. Here we're flying over. Now this is before drones, obviously. So what we're actually in a low altitude Piper Cub, and I'm not in it. This is footage taken from another film, which we'll see more about in a minute. But I want you to observe several things. First of all, it is a coast, obviously. Further, there's no structures on this coast. That is to say, there are no jutties or docks or anything like that moving out in the ocean. And furthermore, there's a very thin layer, you might call it a beachfront here, behind which is something you'll see more about as we fly over it. I'm disconnecting the sound here because it's unrelated, but we'll come back to it in a moment with sound. Now, that's something you should be able to observe very quickly, that within sight of the ocean is fresh water. And what looks like a big puddle here, but in fact, it's a portion of a lagoon, which is separated from the ocean by only this narrow band of inhabited coastline of basically mud huts. And it's that coastline that characterizes the Ivory Coast for hundreds and hundreds of miles, all up and down the coast. In fact, this narration, as we'll hear when I turn on the sound, has an interesting aspect to it. But one of the things you can tell right off the bat is that it's not easy to get in and out of this surf. At the same time, there are reasons why Europeans would want to come ashore here, because there's fresh water. For anybody in a sailing ship, fresh water is it's not so much a commodity as a necessity that anybody has to undertake. And any captain is very aware of where the freshwater sources are. They're looking usually for the ways in which it breaks through to the ocean, and they can get fresh water there in a sailing ship for their crews and the like. But the other thing you got to notice, and is very interesting here, is that people work in groups. You can only see this if you do low-flying aircraft and see something. This is natural because it takes a lot of personnel to get these canoes out over that surf into the ocean. Furthermore, when you build on the coast, you can see that structures eventually emerge, but they're not very sort of impressive in the sense that they have to be set back from the ocean itself, but don't really amount to a whole lot. If we look at the narration that's provided with this film and make some sense of these kinds of structures, it's actually provided by a very famous historian of Africa, Basil Davidson, in a film in 1984 that, thanks to Usman Njai, has been preserved on YouTube for public access. You can look at the links in the talk that I'm giving today to get access to it and watch it. But I've been told by Eric that it's available on film, and maybe even one of the ones we've collected and shared with the rest of the world. But let's see some of his commentary on this. Again, I'll have to share the screen in a way that basically makes it possible for us to hear the sound at this point. I'm going to enable the sound and try to turn up the volume in such a way that we can see it. This is where I could use Ken Burns or someone like his skills to point this out. But let me share that screen and with its sound, give you a sense of his commentary.
Old trading posts like this one had long been the scene of a partnership between maritime traders from Europe and local Africans. By the 1880s, that old partnership was being swept away in a dramatic change, the outcome of a new European drive for overseas empire. Industrialized countries led by France and Britain had begun to invade the black continent, each hoping for new sources of raw materials for its factories, new markets for its manufacturers, and new positions of advantage against its rivals. This was called the Scramble for Africa. By 1914, only two countries remained outside European possession, Liberia in the west and Ethiopia in the east. Britain had seized the lion's share of control. Egypt and the Sudan in the north, the immense wealth of South Africa, valuable colonies like Rhodesia and Kenya, and richly populated territories such as Nigeria and the Gold Coast. France had invaded Algeria in the 1830s. Now, after new wars of conquest, she added more colonies to her empire south of the Sahara, including the island of Madagascar. Little Portugal carved out two vast colonies, Angola and Mozambique, while Imperial Germany took the Cameroons and southwest Africa, and on the east coast, Tanganyika. The vast Congo basin fell to King Leopold of the Belgians. Italy and Spain completed the enclosure. The fate of the continent was utterly changed.
Okay, well, the fate of the continent was utterly changed, according to Basil Davidson, and he actually goes on to explain what he means by that in a very powerful summation. I've never seen the carving up of Africa so elegantly put and graphically illustrated as well as that. But let's take a look at his commentary for this as well, because it's quite interesting. And again, I'll have to share a new screen for this, but you'll get the idea.
Between the colonizing powers themselves, the carve-up was peaceful, but their rivalry was intense. In 1884,
Okay, we'll go now to a full screen on that, and you'll see.
Between the colonizing powers themselves, the carve-up was peaceful, but their rivalry was intense. In 1884, a Congress of the competing governments met in Berlin to settle their disputes. Germany's Iron Chancellor Bismarck was there. And active behind the scenes was the ambitious Belgian king. He spoke for them all when he said, "I am determined to get my share of this magnificent African cake." Any power that could occupy African soil could effectively claim it. Now the task was to stake out frontiers in utterly uncharted land. Said the French Prime Minister, "We have embarked on a gigantic steeplechase into the unknown." The British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury was to say of this period, "We've been engaged in drawing lines on maps where no man's foot has ever trod. We've been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where we were." The great game was to get hold of places and positions of advantage over rivals, no matter what irrational frontiers might result. One of the most absurd cases was the magnificent Gambia River. Britain had long held Bathurst, Banjul today, and was determined to keep this river route to the interior. But France, invading from the west coast, enclosed all the territory surrounding the Gambia River in her new colony of Senegal. So the French were naturally eager to obtain the Gambia River. They offered Britain, in exchange, the much larger and richer Ivory Coast. But the British Parliament insisted on keeping the Gambia, thus dividing the peoples of the region. And the result was, and is, a country that is 300 miles long, but never more than 30 miles wide. What the African inhabitants might think of this colonial carve-up was never asked. The European idea, in the words of one British governor, was to seize African territory and then, as much as possible, rule the country as if there were no inhabitants. In fact, European contempt for Africans now reached new depths, and no wonder. For how otherwise than by asserting that Africans were helpless children, lazy savages, could Christian Europe justify taking their countries away from them? The helpless children, meanwhile, sang their own version of a famous hymn. Onward, Christian soldiers, into heathen lands, prayer books in your pockets, rifles in your hands. Take the happy tidings where trade can be done. Spread the peaceful gospel with the Gatling gun. The European invasions were widely resisted. Conquest was never easy. And sometimes, as these old drawings and photographs testify, conquest led to a ruthless killing that later generations would prefer to forget. Resistance took many shapes. In French West Africa, a focal point was found in Muslim loyalties. Many heroes, still unforgotten, came on that scene. Some, like the Senegalese religious leader Ahmadou Bamba, offered the way of peace, but were still sent into exile. Others, like the fierce warrior leader Samori, fought off French attack after attack, and was crushed and exiled only after years of war. Death took many, strong or weak. With the skulls of earlier wars displayed in their capital, Kumasi, the powerful Ashanti nation ruled over most of modern Ghana. Led by their kings, who had the title of Asantehene, they'd long defended their country against Britain, but now they desperately wanted a peaceful settlement. In 1895, fearing a disastrous war with Britain, King Prempeh made a strong bid for peace from his palace here at Kumasi. He offered the British the right to establish in Ashanti a chartered company with all the concessions, the privilege that such a company could possibly desire. But it wasn't enough, for the British now wanted territorial possession as well as privilege. The Ashanti nation had already fought long, hard battles against the British. But this time, in 1896, they decided to surrender. In a ceremony of deliberate humiliation, the king was made to kiss the British commander's boot and then sent into exile. But it wasn't the end of the story. The British now blundered. A new British governor, Sir Frederick Hodgson, decided that he had to get possession of the sacred golden stool, symbol of the Ashanti nation's soul. Arriving at the British fort here in Kumasi, he ordered the assembled chiefs to hand the stool over. Worse still, he demanded the right to sit on it, something that no person had ever been allowed to do, not even the king himself. To Hodgson's final insult, the Ashanti replied with war. This little fort at Kumasi is what the British had built, just in case, and now they sorely needed it. The few dozen British inmates of the fort were besieged for months and had to eat rats to stay alive. Hodgson's act of folly had exacted a bitter price. Efforts to send in relief from the coast were repeatedly frustrated by Ashanti resistance, until finally the governor and his wife got away to the coast and the absurd but tragic affair could be closed. This ended war between Britain and Ashanti, and a year later, in 1901, the British quietly annexed the country, which became part of the colony of the Gold Coast. All over Africa, the new military technology of automatic guns gave easy victories to the invaders. Countless resistors died, many thousands at the single battle of Omdurman in Britain's conquest of the Sudan. Meanwhile, in another part of the Sudan, the French were also scoring victories. For the most part, public opinion rejoiced. For were these not victories over an inferior species, a kind of joke humanity? There were some critics, but not many, and their voice was ignored or silenced. What really mattered was to do down one's European rivals. If you were British, to get the better of the French in West Africa or of the Germans in East Africa. While orphans like little Uganda were left on the protective doorstep of Father John Bull. Even before 1900, there came a new source of conflict: settlers from Europe. French in the far north, Dutch and then British in the far south, and some Germans. Other settlers were attracted to the good farming land of the east, to Tanganyika, northern and southern Rhodesia, and the British territories of Uganda and Kenya. Once again, nobody asked permission. An early French governor had laid down the golden rule. Wherever good water and fertile land are found, he said, settlers must be installed without questioning whose land it may be. The settlers, not surprisingly, agreed.
Not surprisingly, agreed. That's what the enterprise became, in a sense, making way for the settlers. Now, the settlers were in the areas that he described, but not universally in West Africa. In fact, not at all in West Africa. And Kwame Nkrumah famously said at one point that it was the Anopheles mosquito that deserved a statue, in part because malaria made it impossible in the minds of Europeans for large-scale settlement to take place. Instead, conquest took the form that was really quite brutal, and pictures like this stayed in my mind for years. In part, there was something troubling about this picture in the 1984 film that I didn't recognize immediately. But eventually, it came to me because it came from my book. I had done a study on the resistance of the Baoulé to the French occupation. And I was in Ivory Coast when the book was published. So I hadn't seen it myself. It was published, in fact, in 1980. And I was back doing field work when the Clarendon Press brought it out. And Basil Davidson got hold of it and used not only the pictures, but some of the chapters in it. From the time it was published in 1980 to when I got back in teaching in the anthropology department in 81 at Yale, I dedicated the book, or I should say I placed the inscription at the beginning of it, from an artist, if you want to call writers artists, who depicted what was going on. As Basil Davidson, not many people objected. Some did, but not many. In his framing of it, the majority of the populace was in support of this kind of thing. But Conrad noted in The Heart of Darkness that the conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those with a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. That's what I put at the beginning of the book, because what I was looking at was the not very pretty thing of conquering these peoples who were using Revolutionary War muskets, in effect, to try to resist the European advance with machine guns and with Senegalese troops. The French employed Senegalese and proceeded in the Ivory Coast with a whole series of very audacious and destructive military actions, which in effect left a huge legacy. Hundreds of thousands of people are displaced and or died. Now, we don't actually have a good, reliable figure in terms of deaths, but the vast majority died from malnutrition and starvation, because the tactic the French used eventually, and why it took them 22 years to accomplish this in the central part of the Ivory Coast, was largely one based on agriculture. The Senegalese were, in effect, fed by rice. But rice was not grown in this part of the Ivory Coast at the time. And the local populations lived on yams and plantain bananas. Ultimately, the French uprooted local crops and burned villages to the ground in this particular campaign. And the result was really quite an impact which is documented but not written about very much. By that I mean the documents exist, but they're not written documents. They're photographic documents. And it's really a rich source of history of this period to start looking in detail at a digitized collection of these documents, because you can start to see who's involved and what's involved in these kinds of relationships and analyze them closely in terms of expressions and attitudes and positions in reference to power. Nobody's done an extensive study of this, but it could be done, I think, especially now with the technologies available and the narrative skill that has been developed by people like Ken Burns. I understand that's built into the iMac versions of various things. The iMovie allows you to do narrations, as he did with the Civil War, with these kinds of photos in such a way that you could do and almost approximate what I thought was really quite artful presentation by Basil Davidson in the era before Ken Burns, right? He's doing it physically with real tape and real film. I don't know quite how he accomplished it, but with these still photos, we could do a lot to look at things, including looking at local textiles that were used quite often in building and food supplies. Here is what you can get a sense of the food supply that was used by local populations, plantain, bananas, and yams, that is up against the rice of the conquering French and their Senegalese supporting troops. Now, why is rice important as opposed to yams and bananas? Well, on the basis of the fact that it's desiccatable, you can carry it further. You don't have to carry around yams and plantain bananas to feed yourself. You carry around dried rice, add water, and stir. Every army in the history of humankind has been based on a desiccatable food supply. And ultimately, it means that you're far more mobile. In addition to being better armed, you can move quicker and move longer. That is to say, cover longer distances. This is ultimately what did in the local resistance struggle. The agricultural aftermath of the bloody colonial conquest is worth looking at, because the Ivory Coast was not attracting white settlers, unlike Kenya. And you heard the Tanzania efforts in the northern and southern Rhodesia and in South Africa and in Algeria. The way Basil Davidson characterizes it, settler populations became an issue elsewhere in Africa, but not so much in the Ivory Coast. In effect, the result in agricultural terms was a long and laborious transformation of the colony's total range of agricultural practices, and in fact, the entire ecosystem upon which this part of West Africa had in the past known for thousands of years. It was an explicit attempt to create an agricultural export economy without a white settler class. This is what sets the Ivory Coast apart from everything else in African history. Apart from the fact that there's no more ivory in the Ivory Coast, and it's the only part of the coast or all of Africa that's named after an object, right? that no longer exists there. They're going to do it after military conquest through the promotion of cash crops. In part, this transformation was documented, even though it was not entirely written down. Much of the story was to be told through a careful reading of the photographic record. Okay, here's one of the reasons why there's no ivory left there, because very early on, the elephants were killed and forced into extinction. The other kind of natural extraction that took place very quickly was for large tropical timber, mahogany and fromagier, as it's called. And in this, the mechanization of any stage of the process, particularly after you've physically cut it down, how are you going to get it out of there? Well, you'd have teams of people dragging it through the woods. And when you could introduce tractors, you could actually get a lot more out and get it down to the coast where you could cut it into long squares that fit into the hulls of ships more easily than the round squares. And all of this was done by hand, manual labor. It was then taken down to the coast, and individuals would, in teams, join up to push this out over the surf to the waiting ships. The structures of European dominance in the area were not very substantial, all built on sand. You couldn't build very high. Eventually, they worked from ship to shore by trying to create rail connections. And with the help of the Senegalese troops, they mobilized local labor to pull this off in such a way that you could transform head carriage, which was the way to get goods around the country before the rail system, into rail systems. And here you can see two generations of it. This is kind of pushcart rail that starts first, and then with real ties, a motorized rail system that gets put into place. The infrastructural investment in colonial extraction is crucial in the Ivory Coast. A lot of infrastructure had to be put in before any kind of extraction could occur, because there were no ports. And when you could motorize that infrastructure, you could take out more. Initially, these trains were actually built as part of the military effort to suppress the revolt to the interior. For that reason, they were built quickly and on a narrow gauge, which was in the long run not very wise, because you couldn't put much bulk trade goods on a train coming out with a narrow gauge. Why? Because you take a corner and the whole damn train will fall over if you're going too fast. The gauge had to be much wider for commercial purposes, but it was built for military purposes in the first instance, and that just had to be a troop transport system. When motorized transport came in the form of trucks and cars, this allowed for a whole new kind of infrastructure to extract the cash crops that were being grown. And of course, enough surplus could be had to have parties every once in a while, especially on the 14th of July, where the French insisted everyone celebrate the Bastille Day, as they were now part of the French Empire. The lagoons were largely dominated still by large local canoes. The motorization of the inland waterways did not take place immediately and was challenged by those who dominated things in canoes like that. Very different from Senegal. Senegal had a deep water port. And right on the edge of the port, it could motorize very small units to push trams around with goods. And they could start to bring down to the port mountains upon mountains upon mountains of what? Well, les arachides, peanuts. This is a country built on peanuts, a colony built on peanuts, I should say. And in effect, they could export masses even before sailing ships completely were displaced by motorized and steamships. Basically, what you've got is an extraordinary export economy based on a cash crop of peanuts. But in the Ivory Coast, it was an exogenous plant introduced from Brazil that the agricultural export economy was to grow and flourish over the first century after conquest. Although there were attempts to encourage white settler farmers to migrate to the Ivory Coast, it wasn't very successful. And in the event, eventually, basically, they gave up on the white settler class idea and began to realize they had to work with locals being planters, having been forced to become planters of exogenous crops they had never seen before and had no interest in consuming. They don't even know what cocoa was for, why the Europeans were interested in it, let alone coffee, which was brought in again from Ethiopia at this point to be another export crop. Bananas were local, but they were expanded under control, largely of plantations owned by Europeans, but not on a scale as in other parts of West Africa, as in the Cameroons. But in any case, it was cocoa that became the dominant crop. After the First World War, African planters came to dominate production of all of the crops, but particularly cocoa. And eventually they organized themselves into a cooperative and ended up militating for greater control and led to a movement for independence, ultimately in the 1950s. I'm skipping rather quickly over the narrative here to get you to realize that what we've got is a uni-dependent economy, basically, all aimed at getting things out of the country. The independence movement basically didn't change the structure of that production. In fact, it enhanced it. It was brought out in its strength by the organization of cocoa farmers. And the Ivory Coast became the biggest single producing country in the world shortly after it became independent in 1960s. Not all of this, however, was achieved by the improved status of agricultural workers. In fact, as you'll see, even quite recently, this is problematic, as we'll see.
So the U.S. imports about 21% of the world's chocolate, and the average American eats over 11 pounds of it per year. This hardly comes as a surprise, considering how oversized candy bars are stuffed in every vending machine and store counter across America. But you might be surprised to learn that nearly every time you take a bite of that delicious sweetness, you have the hands of a child slave to thank. Yes, you heard me right. And the corporations most responsible for this horrendous practice are Mars, Hershey, and most of all, Nestle. If you're a fan of this show, you probably already know about my disdain for Nestle, which also happens to be the largest purveyor of bottled water worldwide. Because really, who could forget this?
Hello, Abby. I'm Stephanie from Nestle.
Yes, I was lucky enough to receive a personal response from their giant PR department after calling out the company's method of water extraction and privatization. Well, Nestle isn't just sucking up the world's water supply and selling it back to the poor chaps it's stealing it from. The corporation's also known for their chocolate monopoly and the slave labor that goes along with it. Nestle chocolate milk and powder aside, you might be surprised to learn that Nestle is the umbrella corporation that owns some of your favorite candy, including Kit Kat, Butterfinger, Wonka, Milky Way, Chunky, Smarties, 100 Grand, Baby Ruth, and even chocolate power bars. That's by no means an exhaustive list. To many, it's simply unthinkable that rewarding your child's sweet tooth has come at a devastating cost of another child's indentured servitude. Yet Africa's Ivory Coast produces more than half of the planet's chocolate, and the conditions on these cocoa farms there contain some of the world's most abysmal conditions for child workers.
Shocking pictures of children working with machetes and hazardous chemicals. Some said they were held against their will, forced to work, and many told us they never get paid. UNICEF estimates that more than 200,000 children could be involved in some of the worst forms of child labour.
Yes, at least 200,000 children are enslaved on the cocoa farms in the Ivory Coast alone. It's a country with no real laws against human trafficking. And as a result, children are being trafficked or outright stolen from their parents to work on the farms. These kids are around 11 to 15 years old, and many times even younger. According to an in-depth CNN investigation, they are forced to do hard manual labor, 80 to 100 hours a week, and paid absolutely nothing. Most of the children slaving away their lives on the field had never even eaten chocolate and have no idea what the cocoa is even used for. They have machete scars from cutting the brush all day and are severely beaten or even killed if they try to leave. What's perhaps most disturbing is that this is still happening 13 years after Congress passed the Harkin-Engel Protocol, or the Cocoa Protocol, in 2001. The bill called for public reporting by African governments to voluntarily certify that they had ended the practice of child labor. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Today, human rights organizations report that some of the provisions still haven't been met. And no surprise, it's the biggest corporations who refuse to comply.
Okay, well, you get the idea. We didn't go through it. In effect, an issue here that is being skirted by many or just swept under the rug altogether, especially by large corporations and the conditions upon which they are obtaining some of the material they're exporting. Now, this is part of the condition that was discussed and pointed out during the colonial period. Warnings about the fallacies and dangers of colonial agricultural export economies were in effect pointed out by agronomists and historians, and particularly African economists at the time. Some drew attention to the devastation of the topsoils, like this Dutch ecologist here. Others drew attention, like Basil Davidson, to a whole argument that you could have a lot of growth with no development. As he said, can Africa survive? Arguments against growth without development. For decades since independence, Africa has been told that it should seek trade, not aid. This was Henry Kissinger's favorite phrase and his approach to foreign policy in the third world. Don't look for aid, get involved in trade. The advice of all the multinational organizations, development banks, and nations like the United States was to expand exports and lower tariffs for imported foodstuffs. The result of decades of following this advice has been very largely economically destructive and ecologically devastating, leading many countries to become food import dependent countries as fuel prices have risen. Economic historians have pointed out for over half a century that the barter terms of trade systematically moved against the world's primary producers. Walter Rodney pointed this out and in fact emphasized it in a second book. But he wasn't the only one. In fact, if you look at the dates on these things, in 1970, 21 years, well, more than that. Now, we are now, what, basically 51 years ago, Walter Rodney's first book came out on the history of the Upper Guinea Coast, but his second piece came out 2 years later on how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and Anthony Hopkins produced an amazing compilation of what was known at the time in his economic history of West Africa in '73. But basically, they all agreed and pointed to the fact that the barter terms of trade, that is what you get in return for 1 ton of exported cocoa, systematically declines over time, in part because the trade policies of Europe and the United States were so successful. That is, if you could get everyone to grow cocoa, the net impact of it was to glut the market with cocoa and drive its price down. This was a well-intended policy pursued by industrial countries at the time. While Africa's production has boomed, the output rarely benefited local populations, as we learned through studies like the wheat trap and seeds of famine. This is particularly true as imported food came to substitute for local production and consumption of foods in Africa. All the imported food is directly tied in its price to ultimately the import cost of oil. And as prices of oil go up, the cost of the imported food go up, obviously. So we get cases here where people are, in effect, as we call planting seeds of famine. They're planting things for export. In this case, the cases in the Sahel were particularly egregious. They were exporting onions to the French market. At the same time, they were having to import foodstuffs. This is something that's continued to a large extent, and it's not likely to change in terms of the structure of the food system globally. Monsanto has disappeared. It's been bought out by Bayer, the pharmaceutical firm, and we have a combination now of pharmaceutical and petro-dependent agricultural firms that are appearing, getting bigger and bigger. And they're dangerous trends, not just for Africa, but for the global food supply in general. Individuals who have lots of money are getting more and more into investing in farmland. The farmland grab, as it's being referred to, is now institutionalized. Places like Harvard, Spelman, Vanderbilt, they have their investment funds located in instruments that buy up land in Africa at this point, as elsewhere. And the problem is basically, is this much needed new investment, or is it a neo-colonial land grab that's now occurring throughout much of the continent? Let's take a look and see if we can catch up with some of the issues, because they're really quite dramatic. I'll share the different screen here and give you some sense of the encapsulation of this.
Well, this suggests that chapters in African agricultural history raise some very new but old problems. You can see it in the old African maps that in effect took shape during the slave trade period prior to colonial rule and carved up portions of Africa which were seen for their economic promise. Then there was the scramble for African territory and colonial control. But what's now emerging is a kind of corporate scramble for Africa. Is this a scramble for much needed new investment, or a kind of neo-colonial land grab that's in effect victimizing African populations with a new chapter of it, neo-colonial you could call it, but it's sort of corporate colonialism on a massive scale. It circumstance the nation state to the extent that they really have no longer any control over their own food supply, which is being generated, owned, and operated by foreign multinational corporations. This has been criticized and pointed out as an inevitable impact of the politics of ownership, and in effect, the fact that none of the agricultural development schemes can, in fact, in the long run, survive in Africa because they're based on an illusion about the way ecosystems work. Sir David Attenborough has been very powerful in pointing this out, most notably in the last meeting of the Royal Society in London under the presidency of the Duke of Edinburgh. Sir David Attenborough gave a very clear restatement of the Malthusian dilemma that we all face.
There have been prophets who've warned us of this impending disaster, of course. One of the first was Thomas Malthus. His most important book, an essay of the principle of population, was published over 200 years ago in 1798. In it, he argued that the human population would increase inexorably until it was halted by what he called misery and vice. Today, for some reason, that prophecy seems to be largely ignored, or at any rate disregarded. It's true that he did not foresee the so-called Green Revolution, which greatly increased the amount of food that can be produced in any given area of arable land. And there may be other advances in our food producing skills that we ourselves still can't foresee. But such advances only delay things. The fundamental truth that Malthus proclaimed remains the truth. There cannot be more people on this earth than can be fed.
He concluded with a summation of the Malthus point of view that made it clear the current strategies of African food production will not meet, because they cannot meet, the current projected trajectories of Africa's and the world's food needs.
Many people would like to deny that this is so. They would like to believe in that oxymoron, sustainable growth. Kenneth Boulding, President Kennedy's environmental advisor 45 years ago, said something about this. Anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet, he said, is either mad or an economist.
Tim, I just want to mention that
Borlaug foresaw all of these things. Yes?
Sorry, I just want to interrupt and to mention we're at 1:30, so we're if we're going to have time for questions, we need to wrap up in the next few minutes.
Okay. And worked against the autonomy of African producers. He had no intention of doing that. In fact, he wanted to empower them. But by seeing the impact of what has happened to population growth since the introduction of the Green Revolution technology, and as a result of it, that is, the tripling of the global human population in a record short period of time, something that never happened before in the lifespan of one person, but now is a feature of global agriculture. The human population tripled in the lifespan of one individual born in the late 1940s. Never happened before, won't happen again. But because Norman Borlaug addressed the food problem as one of food scarcity, he forgot the larger context that food is generated in reference to populations, and therefore food and populations are intimately linked over time. And he didn't foresee the interaction of food, population, and the environment as the context in which his policies would have to function long after he died. Those are the problems that the world now confronts. And this is why there's a paradigm shift that's required in addressing these issues, a paradigm shift which he was not prepared for, but his followers at this point are going to have to confront and absorb. Humankind cannot survive future trajectories of current agricultural systems because current practices do not solve the problem of human hunger. Instead, these practices accentuate global and national income inequity and generate the basis for expanded social strife, military conflict, and the syndromes of warfare, migration, and rural income collapse. In the process, these practices effectively expand the absolute numbers of the global poor and generate hunger faster than they can meet the needs of the growing number of the world's hungry populations. The second reason is simple. Current practices deplete topsoil, destroy biodiversity, pollute air, and poison declining water supplies. All of these things are going to be needed in abundant and increasing, not decreasing, supply to provide for stable or growing agricultural production over the long term across the whole world. Thirdly, humankind cannot survive future trajectories of current agricultural systems because current practices are predicated upon an increased, not diminished, consumption of fossil fuels for the production, harvesting, transport, storage, distribution, and preparation of food supplies around the world. Thus, humanity's primary production systems, its agriculture, have come to function within a global food system that is irretrievably dependent on non-renewables. Becoming dependent on non-renewables effectively guarantees that humanity's food system will in time not be renewed. It's about as simple as it gets. For this reason, humankind cannot survive future trajectories of current agricultural systems because the increasing self-destructive character of this petro-intensive model of agriculture is based upon a futile attempt to work with the simple metaphors of market economics in a vastly more complex global ecosystem. Yes, market economics have a role to play in any agricultural system, but in the final analysis, market economics cannot provide the operative logic for any stable and functioning ecosystem because that system cannot be rigged for the principal benefit of just one of its constituent species. It collapses as a system if it's managed for the primary benefit of one of its constituent species. For this reason, and in short, the Borlaug Gates petro-intensive agricultural strategies will not work for humankind because they cannot work within a functioning and enduring global agro-ecosystem. Okay, Eric.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I'm sorry to ask you to wrap it up, but I just want to make sure that we have time. We have maybe 15 or 20 minutes or so for discussion. So I just want to make sure that people in the audience have a chance to ask questions, and maybe that'll feed into additional materials here. So for those of you in the audience, if you do have questions, you can either use the raise hand feature and we can call on you and you'll be able to unmute yourself, or you can type a written question in here. So during the discussion, Tim there had a greeting here from Tom Johnson. Says, "Hey Tim Weiskell, this is Tom Johnson here from Cambridge." And we had someone asking, one of the clips that you showed was from RT, and they're sort of asking about the motivations and trustworthiness of the RT network. I know they're a Russian-owned media company, but that was a question that came in.
It's a fully owned subsidiary of the Russian government, just as most American media is a fully owned subsidiary of corporations.
Yeah.
It's not to be trusted any more than the others. In other words, no, this is not a fount of truth. All sources need to be critically assessed. If you want the further documentation, it's available on the website. The Deutsche Welle did a special on Ivory Coast slavery, which I've linked to, so you can triangulate still more. There's another one from Al Jazeera. And you can imagine there are statements all over the place from Nestle's on this. So anybody interested in doing research on it should look into it thoroughly.
Yeah, I've certainly encountered a number of similar, critiques of Nestle coming from a number of sources. So it's not just a RT source thing, I'm sure. Oh, I see a hand is up here from Madia Thompson. Madia Thompson.
Yes. Hi, Professor Weiskell. You know, I'm trying to remain calm because I'm so excited to hear someone talking about places in West Africa, and particularly Côte d'Ivoire, where one, yeah, you know, where this is. And so I'm very happy. I didn't turn, unfortunately, I was otherwise occupied, and so I couldn't see things from the beginning. But I was just wondering if you had been able to follow how recently, or you've been how recent your information is about the state of Ivorian agriculture now. And when I say recent, I mean since the disturbances of 2010. You know,
no, it's not recent. I regret. I have not been out to the field since. One of the things that needs to be studied in detail, and maybe you can do it for us, is the disturbances in 2010, in fact, the Civil War, and its what would we say, the preconditions for civil war are intimately tied up with the slavery system that were immobilized during the colonial period between the Baule and the people from the north. You may be acquainted with the kind of basically the farming system that emerged was one that was a legacy of the slave trade. Slaves were brought from the northern part of the Ivory Coast to the forested areas and were sold eventually down on the coast. But when that stopped, they were put to work largely through plantation systems that rendered profits to the owners of the land, the Baule, for 1/3 of their total production. In other words, Northerners were given the chance to work on lands owned by the Baule and others in the south at the Yanyi, but only in exchange for 1/3 of their crop. And in that way, the resident populations in the south who claimed the land as prior occupants basically made money off of the indentured labor, shall we call it, of those who had come in from the north. Now, that tension ultimately led to a huge divide between the north and the south and the breakout of a civil war. I have not caught up since. In fact, one of the tragedies of the Civil War is that a lot of the documentation about the colonial period has been lost as the archives were destroyed.
That's very interesting because that's a little bit of information that I don't have. You've actually put a whole lot of things. Côte d'Ivoire is rather close to me in many ways, and I won't go into too much detail, but let's just say that my father spent many years there.
Oh, good.
So it's, and there's certain things that I, as the academic, am somewhat interested in.
Oh, good.
And you know, okay, so the other question, the follow-up question I had essentially was about the state of the rice programs, because you did mention how rice has now been, you suggested what I remember seeing when I was actually in Côte d'Ivoire many years ago working on a rice project.
Right.
Which is essentially that rice in fact had to become one of the principal staples of the country.
Right. Rice and acheke. Acheke has been developed as a manioc. You know, again, this is a very interesting history of cassava or manioc or acheke as it's made into a local consumable product. That is introduced from the New World, and the history of all of the introductions is fascinating. But you're right, there's been a concerted effort on the part of the government to expand rice production for local consumption, in part because they got caught in the 60s and depending on imports from China in an odd sort of way. When I was doing field work out there in the 70s, people were very proud of two things: big bags of China rice, and they would bring out for me little boxes of Uncle Ben's rice. Uncle Ben was thought to be a successful American capitalist who had managed to get rice into the Ivory Coast. And so they thought as an American, I would love Uncle Ben's rice.
I see. Oh, very interesting. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
So we've had a couple written questions come in. The first one here is asking if you are encouraged by the growth of renewable energy worldwide. Is it possible that agricultural inputs, fertilizers, etc., will be based on wind-powered or solar-powered production of inputs?
Well, I hope so. I mean, we have to move as quickly as possible. Ultimately, you've got to run the whole thing on solar throughput. The problem with doing that is that everyone else is realizing that simultaneously. And part of what I wasn't able to get to here was the way in which African land grabs are being undertaken now, not so much in the Ivory Coast, but particularly in Sierra Leone and in the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, to produce palm oil for the use in European engines and diesel engines, and to produce maize for basically not human consumption, but for ethanol production. Now, that's not quite as simple as that. They're not exporting maize for ethanol production, but they're reducing the imports of maize, which a lot of countries had come to depend on from the West, from European and American sources. Those imports are getting more scarce, therefore more price. And that is in part due to the switchover of maize production to ethanol production. So it's actually gotten worse since the Obama years, when ethanol production took off in the United States in 2008 because of the subsidies provided for switching to ethanol production. So it's a global food system now, studied in detail by people like Lester Brown, in such a way that basically Africa is at the end of a whip that is being cracked from some other part of the world, and food scarcities can emerge overnight. If, as example, it happened in 2008 when Russia decided not to export wheat. Well, in the process, the price of wheat doubled, and lots of people went hungry in Africa. So that's part of what I wanted to get to, and we can talk about it at length at some other point. But basically, Africa has not gained its food self-sufficiency. It was encouraged for the colonial period and afterwards to get involved in the economics of comparative advantage. That is, you grow cocoa, coffee, bananas, and like, do more and more of that, and we'll provide you with the foodstuffs. So you get the flow from the African tropics of all the tropical goods to the northern countries, and all the staple foods coming down from the north, surplus production, to Africa. Now, the trouble with that is that the import costs of that can't help but rise because they're dependent upon fossil fuels. And in effect, you're vulnerable to any disruption, pandemics or any other kind, in the international trade system. And the result is very quickly whole portions of Africa can be left, the word is not appropriate, high and dry, but basically bereft of a food supply. Now, when you add on top of that the crises that are coming down the pike because of climate change and pandemics, you can see that Africa's agricultural sector is in real vulnerable circumstances at this point.
So I guess this is very much related, but do you believe that the fundamental challenges of food production are technical, that is something to be solved by engineers and technicians, or legal and political, that is to be addressed through policies and laws? Or to be more specific, if we address and ensure the local ownership of land and avoid corporate or foreign ownership of land, will we be in a better place in the future?
Well, as they say, good luck with that. In other words, it's hard to figure out how you can stop a multinational at this point in this effort to grab land. That's happening in effect. There aren't any instruments strong enough. The UN is asking for voluntary restraint on this issue of land grabbing at this point. But ultimately, the problems are neither technical nor political. They're ecological. And what's so tragic in Africa was pointed out by the Dutch ecologists back in the 1950s and 60s is that topsoil is being eroded and destroyed. Water sources are being poisoned and again destroyed. The basic fundamentals of the agronomy of African production are being attacked at the same time that the variables, that is the wind and weather that is going to hit them, are being accentuated. Now, the problems that are expressed immediately are droughts and floods, right? In Mozambique or in Southern Africa, you can have droughts for some years and floods in other years, both of which devastate agriculture, right? And you get people driven off of farmland into, in many cases, refugee camps or cities where they're having to consume greater and greater amounts of food that aren't produced in Africa, but are shipped in. The dependency ratio, in effect, has shifted very decidedly towards external dependence on food supplies. Now, if you do that too long, especially if it breaks out in civil war in many parts of Sudan and elsewhere in Ethiopia, and you get people in refugee camps long enough, the agricultural expertise is not passed down from one generation to another. And you're taking people out of the agricultural sector at the same time, that is, they're not learning how to grow things. At the same time, they're becoming dependent upon an external resources for the food supply. So it's a real bind. And I'm not sure that the political structures are yet available. It's not just a matter of redistributing land or putting in new incentives for locally grown foods and the like. It really is a kind of structural problem that's far more fundamental and has to do with now the big reversal in international agricultural advice that has taken place in the last few years, when they realized the economics of comparative advantage has driven these countries into real disasters. And they're now the new watchword for the international agricultural organizations is survivability, or as they're calling it, local sustainability. That is, we want to produce or encourage economies to invest in food self-sufficiency, right? Self-sufficiency. Well, wait a minute. That's where we started out in the colonial period. If you recall, historically, people were disdainful in the colonial administrations of subsistence agriculture because it only produced for self-sufficiency, right? They had to be encouraged to go into cash cropping, into export agriculture. Now, self-sufficiency is being seen as a good goal. How are you going to engineer that? That is, reduce the distance between production and consumption and valorize local production techniques and the intelligent use of local agricultural resources without depending upon vast amounts of fertilizers, tractors, and imported petro-intensive systems. That's going to have to be wound down, but its problem is located ultimately in the ecology of agricultural production, not the economics, the politics, or in effect, the technology being pushed by the petro-intensive efforts in the tradition of Norman Borlaug. Now, it's not fair to blame Norman Borlaug for everything that's come since to the world food system, but by giving, in effect, a big leap forward for petro-intensive agriculture, he's placed large parts of Africa and certainly other parts of the third world in a very precarious circumstance where more and more people are coming to depend on fewer and fewer crops grown in narrower and narrower regions with greater and greater subsidies from something we know is becoming more scarce, petroleum. It's becoming more scarce, which isn't its biggest problem. It's also having enormous system-wide impact in the CO2 it contributes to the atmosphere, and therefore is changing the very circumstance of agriculture, that is, the climate. So you've got to wind it down and relocalize it. But the instruments we have are so, it's like trying to do dentistry with a jackhammer. In effect, you're not going to be very effective by just saying, well, we can pass a law or we can give out new incentives. They've got to be much more attentive to the local ecology of these things.
So Nat Treadway, who asked that first question, I should have mentioned that first, but follow up to say, couldn't local countries tax the heck out of corporate landowners, which it sounds like you're a little bit skeptical about.
Well, you could, but again, good luck with that. I mean, if you think corporations are going to be neutral on the fact of being heavily taxed.
Yeah, he acknowledges that that's maybe not feasible right now. So we have time for maybe one or two more questions. I see Tom Johnson has his hand up. So Tom, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, well, it's great to hear and see and hear from everybody. Tim, wonderful presentation. I especially like the way you frame the formal topic within your personalized history of African studies, and I especially appreciate the way you honor the ancestors of African studies. I was fortunate to buy Basil Davidson's video series when it was available and affordable. But also Daniel McCall, who never received the recognition he deserved. He retired before I started to enter grad school at BU, but he always took an interest in me, and I really appreciate that. My question or comment will sort of continue doing what you're doing, which is placing the details of your talk within the broader context of African studies and global issues. What I hear you saying is that it resembles the radical Afro-pessimism of the 60s and 70s, René Dumont, Frantz Fanon, and so forth, which is a contrast to, the last 15 years or so of, let's say, cautious optimism about where Africa is going and where it is now. And so I wanted to ask you if that is implicit or you want to make it explicit. And my guess is that in a way, both views are true, but what we're seeing is some sectors of economy and society prospering while others remain left behind. Kind of an old story, but with much more urgency with global climate crisis operating now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tom. I think in general, you're quite right there, that basically I was heavily influenced by people who observed what was going wrong early on and were swept aside by the euphemisms and hysteria, one might say, of growth economics, thinking that you could infinitely grow on a finite planet. That just can't happen. I mean, that's the new realism. It's not so much about Africa. It's about the recognition of the limits of the human enterprise, basically. You can't, as Sir David Attenborough put it, you can't have more people on the planet than can be fed. So you got to be attentive to how they're going to be fed.
So I think we have time for one more quick question. I see that Jim McCann had a question here. Thank you, Tim. The ecological context of food production links to climate change, and this affects the land grab phenomenon. Can you address this? IPCC mapping directly addresses water issues for key regions where the land grab is taking place, right? Or no, you should say. That's how he wrote it.
Yeah, well, it does. The IPCC has done its best to try to chart some of these projections about where we're going to have droughts and where we're going to have floods and the like. Basically, the overall question has been answered more thoroughly by people like Bill Muma out at Tufts University, who worked for years for the IPCC in summarizing the science of the world on this issue. And the emphasis has been on things are going to be more what they were like. In other words, drier places are going to get drier, wetter places are going to get wetter. And in the process, the base temperature is going to be increased in all areas. This means that severe weather can be quite dramatic and quite devastating to agriculture in any one area. And droughts can be more prolonged, maybe going into 200 or 300 year periods I mean, really strange weather. This is not so much climate change as climate weirding, as John Holdren put it. It's not global warming, it's global weirding that we're going to be up against. And he mentioned this for years while he was in the government, and then in the Woods Hole Research Center since then. But people are looking at the stability of agricultural production on the Earth's surface, are getting increasingly concerned about water supplies, and especially the vulnerability of irrigation systems that were so much a feature of the Borlaug Green Revolution effort. It was the package of irrigated water plus all the pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers that you applied, all of which are becoming more expensive at the same time that water supplies are diminishing and becoming more and more polluted from other efforts, as well as agriculture, but other efforts like fracking in large parts of the world for oil reserves. So the trajectories are not good. They're going in the wrong direction. Relocalize, re-autonomize seems to be the long-range strategy for self-sufficiency, now that the UN is embracing this notion of food self-sufficiency, or what they're calling it, food security. Now you find all the same organizations that promoted agricultural exports several decades ago are now saying, oh, we got to worry about food sufficiency. So yeah, keep an eye on the weather maps and the new projections of what it's going to mean as close as you can through the IPCC and other local science organizations, but don't bank on predictable weather. That's going to be the very the big joker in the pack, in a sense, is the switch. And globally, the problems come when the American Midwest can't deliver the grain supplies floated down the St. Lawrence River and distributed to the world. They were called miracle crops because they were planted in Iowa and they came up in Burundi, right? I mean, this is, if you look at the global grain trade, it's more and more dependent on long distance. That's not a good strategy in a period for stability in a period of climate abrupt shift.
Well, thank you, Tim. We're over time now, so I'm sorry to the folks who had questions outstanding. Hopefully they can reach out to you, Tim, via email.
Sure, or we can look, if anyone wants to do it, they can, let's see if I can share the last slide here. Basically, you can, the last slide, and with an iPhone, catch up on things. In other words, this is, let's see if we can run through it here, but basically I can't summarize this in such a way that's useful, but you can scan in the QR code and get to the supporting information behind this on a website that has now about 60,000 links off of it. So you're welcome to use whatever you can get access to.
Thank you, Tim. So yeah, thanks, Tim. A couple upcoming events. Next Monday, we will not be having a Rodney. It is the Patriots Day holiday here in Massachusetts. But our next and final Rodney seminar for the semester will be Monday, April 29th, 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time with Abdullah Sunay, presenting on projecting life, Boko learning, and religiosity on a university campus in West Africa. Your registration for today's event will also work for that. We also have on Wednesday, April 28th, I think that is actually not, oh, that is April 28th. I'm sorry. The next Rodney is April 26th. I put the wrong date there. On Wednesday, April 28th, 2 days later, 6 p.m., we'll have our next Cinema Freak film discussion about Fatima. You can watch the film if you're BU affiliated with the link I put there in the chat. And then finally, there's our full events calendar you can see at the end. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Tim, and we'll see everyone soon.
Thank you very much, Eric, for setting all of this up and managing it.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.